Excelsior, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cam Charlton, Architecture Lead for Cisco Security here at Westcon-Comstor, and I'm excited to be introducing our next speaker, Corinne Fermark, Cisco's Cybersecurity Partner Specialist for New Zealand. Corinne has a long career in security as an ISO 27001 lead auditor and forensic digital investigator, and is going to be taking us through the easiest way to protect our workforce, workloads, and workplaces. Please feel free to use the Q&A panel on the side, and if we haven't got time, Corinne and we will be publishing all the responses by email after the event. Please join me in welcoming Corinne Fermark to Imagine 2020. Over to you, Corinne.
Thank you very much, Cameron. I'm going to go straight into my presentation because I'd like to maximize the time. We're going to have a discussion about zero trust today, but I want to start it off by doing a bit of the problem statement. And I think you guys have all heard the problem statement quite extensively, and I don't necessarily have to, hammer on this point. But if you look from a data visualization point of view at how these breaches have occurred over and have increased over the last few years, it's really interesting if we look at some of the largest breaches up until the end of 2019, when we then color that slide quite differently by looking at which of these breaches actually breached stolen credentials. And when I present this, in a live environment, I always ask the crowd, who knows what Firebase is? And very rarely people can tell me, but Firebase is the backend database to all Google Play Store applications. So you've ever bought anything on Google Play Store, your login credentials was breached. And again, that comes to the point that most of us and most users that we manage in our environments don't have more than one password for private use. What are some of the scary things that we've seen? I think as we watch and constantly watch the news over the last few weeks as we've been in lockdown, the narrative hasn't changed all that much. We see large organizations, including schools and hospitals, being hacked, most of us being compromised with a need to access data around COVID. And we see a number of scams, including, giving us access to this information and then scraping all of our cookie files off these websites. I think it shows how critically opportunistic cyber criminals are. When it comes to something big in the world happening, they immediately have an answer to how to gain more information around it. But if we look at our IT landscape, it is quite unique as COVID has forced us into deperimeterization. And effectively, we look at an evolving perimeter. Most of us today, if you are still in a state of operation as a business, have remote users. In the past, we would say remote users, contractors, or third parties, but effectively everybody is working remotely these days. Then we have these personal and mobile devices. Again, in the past, we used to call it bring your own disaster. So people had the ability to bring devices to the network that we didn't necessarily have the liberty to sanction. And then lastly, we have this growing landscape of IoT devices that accesses, and on the other side of the circle, it effectively looks at what do these devices and people access? They access some kind of workload somewhere. Hybrid cloud, software as a service. And this is how we evolve as an IT organization. But how does it challenge us? So it challenges us in the instance that traditionally we have extended excessive trust. But it's now become very prevalent that we need to know who's on our network. We need to know which devices are on our network and ultimately have a proper view of who accesses what. And I think that's where the narrative for zero trust becomes very prevalent. How does this change us from a business impact point of view? Firstly, it's very critical to understand that in an incident response that is slow, 10,000 devices can be encrypted within 10 minutes. 300% increase on IoT malware and malicious bots that we see. And again, then I take you back to the bubble slide that I started off the presentation with by saying 81% of breaches involve weak or stolen credentials. And again, our security tools are going blind because of privacy and encryption methods. I think it's not what they set out to be a hampering factor, but it definitely has become a hampering to us securing networks by encrypting more and more and more. And when we find that 65 and 72% of their network these days are encrypted. But how does this effectively operate? So when we trust too much, it is very clear that we have the ability for a malicious user to run a reconnaissance. And we always want to blame email as being the culprit, but it is number one when it looks at a threat vector. Because the user has the ability to click on a phishing email or even malware embedded in adware on general websites. Once that comes inside the network, it has the ability to deploy the malware and spread it laterally before ultimately the criminals have the ability to monetize that data by virtue of a call out. Again, I want to reiterate that 81% of these breaches use stolen or weak credentials. And that might be by hand of a user or possibly just by clicking on a mail and sometimes surrendering some of these credentials. What does all of this have in common? One, stolen identity. Two, it calls back. At some stage of any of these breaches, there's a call back for data to get monetized. But let's have a look at how we've secured networks traditionally. So I think it's become evident in some of the very advanced tools that we're seeing these days that our wall is not necessarily as effective against the sophistication of tools that we're seeing out there. When we talk about deperimeterization, people say to me all the time, oh, zero trust is such a new concept. Zero trust is by no means a new concept in this world that we face. Zero trust was started by the Jericho Forum in 2004, and it is developed quite extensively, taking on the body of Beyond Corp, published by Google throughout 2014, and ultimately Forrester coining the term zero trust. This initial term was based on next-gen firewall capability, but as we stand today, zero trust is only today, 15 years down the line, getting real traction within IT environments because we understand the basic tenet of it. And what is the basic tenet of zero trust? As a non-native English speaker, I always joke at this junction point of the presentation and say I only have one stab at this word, but effectively the basic tenet of zero trust is ubiquitous least privilege access. That effectively means that you need to have the ability to grant access very specifically in all instances. So does a reception staff member to the team need access to the payroll administration database? Definitely not. And that is the kind of least privilege access that we need to have the ability to enforce on our networks and our IT environments. So what do? We assume that everything is malicious. The device is malicious, the user is malicious, the data is malicious, the network is malicious. And what do we then do? We need to have an automated visibility and trust verification process. And this usually comes with a stack of technologies that we plat together to make a really great wall, if we can call it that, under deperimeterization, that creates the wall or gatekeeper for what data, how data should behave and how the network traffic should behave. And ultimately, this tells us whether it is a compliant device, whether the identity is verified, possibly in the likes of a tag. Does this user get access to the rest of the network? Do they get access to only basic functions? And then it looks at how clean some of our attachments are, and it also looks at some of the encryption protocols. Cisco has come up with a zero trust framework in a very specific, and we call it, a three-step rotational process, looking at, firstly, we need to establish the trust. For you to be able to verify who needs access to what, we need to know who the who is, and that they say who they say they are, or who they present to be. Then towards the middle, we need to have the ability to enforce trust-based access. And then at the end, looping all of this back on a continuous basis, we need to continuously verify trust. These are done through a multitude of technologies. Firstly, multi-factor authentication. When we look at multi-factor authentication, 67% of our research shows that it is an absolute grudge use for your user base. So users tell you outright, I only use multi-factor authentication because my employer forces me to do so. And in that forceful manner, I effectively do it only for my work environment. Very few people use multi-factor authentication across a multitude of platforms. Then we need to have the ability to enforce this trust-based access across all of our IT stack, being networks, application, resources, users, and things. And then lastly, we need to have the ability to continuously verify trust. The original tenant use established trusts are still true on a continuous basis. So once the session has closed, if you log on again, are you still who you say you are, if we can explain it in the most simplistic way? What is our answer and our primary solution to this? So in the first instance, we look at your workforce. And when we look at your workforce, we look at multi-factor authentication for the workforce, establish trust level for users and devices. And I think it is most important when we talk about multi-factor authentication that we also need the ability to look at the health of the device. Then we look at the workload, and we have a multitude of workloads sitting all over the show, from hybrid cloud, private cloud, some on-prem solutions if we still have a traditional stack. And those workloads we need visibility into those workloads to give restrictive access, because again, we talk about least privilege access. So a user should only have access to what they need. And in that narrative, we also need to look at contextual policies. And then lastly, we look at SD access and establishing least privilege access control for all users and devices, and also more specifically, including our IoT as that gets access onto the network. Let's look at this in a little bit more detail. Firstly, we look at our workforce. When we look at our workforce from a zero trust perspective, there are three basic things that we need to have the ability to do. Verify the identity of the user, ensure trustworthiness of the device, and this is really important. Does the user use this device on a regular basis is a good insight as to whether that trust should be established. And then enforce risk-based and adaptive access policies. When we look at the Duo solution from Cisco, we have a three-tier approach in which we say, confirm the user identity via any device. Gain access and visibility across your whole workforce onto a single dashboard in terms of what the health is of the use of identities and the use of devices. And then lastly, ensure device security across a multitude of platforms. Create custom policies that fits the risk, the risk adoption rate of your organization by allowing these policies to be pushed to the end user device. What does that effectively do? If you remember how I explained how the exploit comes into the network, you would now realize that if we had verified the identity, we would have blocked it straight across before the reconnaissance can enter the network and start spreading laterally. So this is really important to remember, because we didn't trust, we didn't give access to all of the other devices. And again, this includes our server base if all of that is on the inside of the network. Then we look at the workload, and I think workload being a very futuristic term of what we've historically termed hosting and cloud services, but it boils down to the fact that we look at an individual workload, and that could be an application, it could be a cloud service, it could be a dedicated hosted service that gets accessed by a multitude of users. When we look at zero trust within the workload, it is critical that you have visibility and behavior modeling. Why is that? Because we find that when you look at a workload and you understand how it behaves within normal conditions, you could immediately identify when that is out of pattern. And that gives you a concern compromise index that tells you that that server or that workload or that application is running some form of malware. Pre-workload and micro segmentation policies, again, gives that least privileged trust across your workload, and then real-time security and health of the workloads is pivotal to understand whether this is on a continuous basis, checking whether that is normal for that workload. Cisco does it with Tetration. Tetration is in-house developed by Cisco and is one of our key prides within our security stack. Lastly, we look at the workplace. And the workplace probably being a mute topic as we are all working from home these days, but the workplace still being a critical place where we transact from a business perspective. When we look at the workplace, we look at SD Access and, our Cisco identity engine. And firstly, we need to have the ability to establish that trust by discovering and classifying devices onto our network. And that buckles that narrative in terms of, is it an IoT device? Is it a bring your own disaster device? Or is it a device that was issued by the corporate? In the middle sphere, we look at context-based networking and access and control policies across users and things. And lastly, on a continuous trust verification model, we say that we continuously secure the health, look at the security, health, and monitoring of devices. So as devices come on and off the network, we look at the health and the security of that devices and whether they comply with the posture and policy that we set out for them. And if all of that has failed, we ultimately still need to look at the callback. As a securist, you'll understand that any kind of malware to be monetized needs to call back home to a command and control server at some stage. So the callback is critical. Cisco blocks that callback by virtue of Umbrella, looking at malware, callbacks, and phishing, and effectively looking at all of your DNS lookups. And when we look at our DNS, we would want that pipe to be as clean as possible. And with our workforce working home, I think that is probably one of the most pivotal steps that we need to take in securing our workforce. When we look at the most simplistic view on this, we look at the Lockheed kill chain that again looks at the recon, stage, launch, exploit, install, and then ultimately callback of these kind of scenarios. And if we in the beginning under recon and stage had verified the target identity, we probably wouldn't have had it onto the network. But once it is on the device or onto the network and it is starting to launch an exploit or install any kind of malware, it would ultimately be stopped by putting a gatekeeper in place looking at the callback. This takes us back to the initial explanation that I did when we looked at the very basic in terms of how the network gets infected. And I showed it over a few slides, and it comes back to the monetization of the data, or effectively taking control over the device or the network, or doing advanced reconnaissance onto the network. But for that, you need the callback. The command and the control server is what gives these criminals control over what's going on the inside of our network. If we can block that with Umbrella, it gives us the power and the last form of cut-off before our data or our devices can be monetized or even created to be bots in another attack. It really is important to understand how this landscape pivots together, looking back at that trust verification as a zero trust basic tenet. In conclusion, it's really important to understand that when you look at a product set from a zero trust perspective, we're trying to place products in the line in protecting our workforce, our workload, and our workplace in the best way that we can. Cisco owns Talos. Talos is the single largest non-governmental threat hunting organization in the world. And this effectively means that we look at this from a global perspective. Our researchers look at malware across all of the traffic that we see globally. And when we aggregate that data, we have the ability to place that intelligence not only in products like titration, looking at workloads, how do these things behave normally, we also can put the counterintelligence into those applications from a behavior analytic point of view. By counterintelligence, I mean we have the ability to, as we find malware, model how it behaves on a device, model how that would make a workload behave, and we put that intelligence in how we do behavior modeling from a product perspective. Talos gives this input and research into all of our product development, and I think it is critical if we peer with any technology organization to understand how big their threat research organization is. And as I mentioned, from the data that we daily receive, we do more DNS lookups than Google themselves from a global view perspective. And this is really important because this is where the intelligence comes from that we build our technologies out with. Cameron, I think I'm going to be pivoting back and saying when we talk about zero trust, in conclusion, we talk about securing the workforce with multi-factor authentication, the workload with visibility, and the workplace with ensuring that micro-instances continuously verifying who's on the network. Cameron, thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Corinne. To steal a phrase from Mugatu in Zoolander, zero trust has never been so hot right now. We've got a couple of questions on the, no, Mugatu said so hot right now. We've got a couple of questions on the Q&A. The first one is from Rogan. MITRE ATT and CK framework is gaining in popularity and appears to align well with everything we've discussed. What does Cisco think of it as a testing methodology?
So I need to caveat that. I certainly don't speak on behalf of Cisco. However, as a knowledge carrier in this field, I'd like to answer that. So some of the MITRE frameworks has gained quite popularity in terms of testing your resilience in this discipline. And I think when you look at and you compare the frameworks across it, be it MITRE, be it NIST, be it OWASP, be it whatever framework you apply, most of them have a commonality. And I think you need to understand what those commonalities are. And the commonality for this talks back to how and why zero trust is gaining so much, likes, if I can call it that, in the industry. It goes back to that basic tenet of least privilege. It says to the most simplistic manner that you need to ensure that you know who is on your network and what they're accessing. Because out of that basic transaction itself, we can gain the most information into securing our networks.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that. The second question is, how easy is Duo to deploy?
Oh, wow. Duo is very easy to deploy. And I wanted to actually put a slide on that from a use case perspective. I will share that it really is easy. We've seen large deployments go up, and it depends on which level of Duo you deploy. But it is effectively a virtual deployment that goes via an app on the end device. But we've seen very large deployments happen in as little as a few hours.
Fantastic. I think we're pretty much up for time, but what I would like to do is make this presentation, because it's so good and the content is so relevant to all of our partners and end users, make a version of this available to people. So Corinne and I will work on that together. If you'd like to know more about Duo or Umbrella, please feel free to reach out to Corinne or myself and Andre Camilo as well, and we would love to talk further about Duo and Umbrella and the cool things that Cisco are doing. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much, Corinne, for a fantastic presentation. Hope you all enjoy the rest of your Imagine 2020 experience. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you very much, guys.
Cheers.